September 3rd, 1943, New York Harbor, dawn. The transport ship cut through morning mist, its hull heavy with human cargo. Below deck, 300 German prisoners of war stood silent in the half-darkness, hands gripping metal railings as the vessel rolled in the harbor swell. They had been at sea for 11 days. 11 days of K-rations and salt air, and the constant metallic groan of a Liberty ship pushing west across the Atlantic. Most of them had been captured in Tunisia in the final collapse of the Afrika Korps, when Rommel's Desert Army had disintegrated under the weight of Allied superiority in men and material and air power. They had surrendered expecting death, or at best years of slow starvation in some British prison camp in Egypt. Instead, they had been loaded onto ships and sent west, across an ocean most of them had never seen, toward a continent that existed in their minds primarily as an abstraction. America, the industrial colossus, the mongrel nation of immigrants and capitalists that Dr. Goebbels had assured them was on the verge of internal collapse. When they were finally brought up on deck, blinking in the morning light, what they saw made no sense. The Statue of Liberty rising green from the harbor, the Manhattan skyline beyond it, hundreds of buildings reaching skyward, glass and steel and concrete, in quantities that seemed impossible, decadent, obscene. Not a single bombed-out structure, not one collapsed facade, not a trace of the destruction that covered every major city they had known in Europe. The city before them looked untouched, prosperous, surging with a vitality that contradicted everything they had been told about American decline and weakness. One prisoner, whose name appears in declassified records as Gefreiter Klaus Hartmann, would write years later in his memoir that his first thought upon seeing New York was that the Americans must have built fake buildings, elaborate propaganda sets to demoralize incoming prisoners. The alternative, that this abundance was real, that America had built all of this while simultaneously supplying Britain and Russia and fighting wars across two oceans, was too disturbing to accept immediately. It suggested that Germany had been fighting an enemy whose resources were not merely superior, but existed on a different order of magnitude entirely. This cognitive dissonance, this gap between expectation and reality, would define the experience of German prisoners of war in America throughout the conflict. Over 400,000 German POWs would pass through American prison camps between 1943 and 1946, housed in over 500 facilities scattered across the continental United States. They came expecting hell and found something far more disturbing than any hell could be. They found abundance. They found casual waste. They found a civilian population that seemed barely aware a war was happening. They found food in quantities that made their military rations back home look like starvation diets. They found guards who were bored rather than brutal, administrators who followed Geneva Convention protocols with bureaucratic precision, and an American society so wealthy that it could afford to feed its enemies better than Germany fed its own soldiers. The psychological impact of this discovery would ripple through the German military consciousness in ways that American authorities initially failed to understand, and that would ultimately contribute to undermining whatever remained of German fighting spirit in the war's final years. But to understand what the German POWs saw and why it shattered them, one must first understand what they expected to see, what they had been told about America, and how thoroughly Nazi propaganda had warped their conception of the nation they were fighting. The Third Reich's portrayal of America rested on several foundational myths, repeated endlessly in newspapers, radio broadcasts, newsreels, and military indoctrination. First, that America was a culturally inferior nation, a mongrel society of mixed races and ethnicities, lacking the social cohesion necessary for effective warfare. The American soldier, according to Wehrmacht intelligence briefings, was soft, undisciplined, motivated only by material comfort rather than ideological conviction or warrior honor. Second, that America's industrial capacity, while impressive in raw numbers, produced shoddy goods, quantity over quality, machines that broke down and weapons that failed under real combat conditions. Third, that American society was on the verge of internal collapse, torn apart by racial conflict, labor strikes, and the fundamental contradictions of Jewish-dominated capitalism. Fourth, that the American Homefront was suffering under wartime deprivation, that rationing had reduced the civilian population to near starvation, that American cities were experiencing the same hardships as German cities. These were not fringe beliefs. These were official assessments taught to soldiers, repeated by officers, embedded in the worldview that German troops carried into combat. When German soldiers surrendered to American forces in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, they expected to be entering a system that would confirm these beliefs. They expected prison camps run with the same brutal efficiency as German camps. They expected meager rations. They expected hard labor and harsh discipline. They expected to see evidence of a nation straining under the burden of total war, barely holding together on the edge of collapse. Instead, they got off trains at rural camps in Texas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, Kansas, and saw vast horizons of untouched farmland, towns that had no bomb damage because no bombs had ever fallen, civilian populations that looked healthy and well-fed and disturbingly unconcerned about the global conflict their nation was fighting. They were processed through intake systems that recorded their names and ranks and home addresses with typewriters and carbon paper. Bureaucratic efficiency that suggested unlimited resources, unlimited time, unlimited administrative capacity. They were issued uniforms, not threadbare cast-offs, but new clothes with PW stenciled on the back, durable cotton that was clean and properly sized. They were assigned to barracks that had real beds, mattresses, blankets, heat in winter, and ventilation in summer. And then they were fed. The food is where the cognitive dissonance became unbearable. American military regulations required that prisoners of war be fed rations equivalent to what American soldiers received. This was not generosity. This was Geneva Convention compliance enforced by army inspectors and Red Cross observers. But the effect on German prisoners, accustomed to wartime rations that had been declining in quality and quantity since 1941, was profound and disorienting. Breakfast in American POW camps typically included eggs, bacon, bread, butter, jam, coffee with real sugar, and fresh milk. Lunch might be soup, sandwiches, fruit, and more coffee. Dinner could involve meat. Actual meat, not ersatz substitutes, potatoes, vegetables, bread, and dessert. The daily caloric intake for a German POW in an American camp was approximately 3,000 calories, compared to the roughly 2,000 calories that German soldiers at the front were receiving by 1943, and significantly more than German civilians were getting under increasing rationing restrictions. The psychological impact of this disparity cannot be overstated. Food in wartime is not merely nutrition. It is a signal about a nation's capacity, its priorities, its confidence in its own survival. Germany had been at war since 1939, and its food supply had been under increasing strain as Allied bombing disrupted agriculture, as labor shortages reduced farm productivity, as the Eastern Front consumed resources without producing equivalent agricultural output from occupied territories. By 1943, German civilians were experiencing genuine hunger, not starvation, but chronic undernourishment, declining health, increasing desperation. And these civilians knew, through letters and rumors and the evidence of their own eyes, that their soldiers at the front were not eating well either. The entire nation was tightening its belt, sacrificing for the war effort, enduring shared hardship. And then German soldiers were captured and discovered that their enemies were feeding them more and better food than their own government had provided even in peacetime. This was not just unexpected. This was ontologically disturbing. It suggested that Germany was not fighting a war of equals, was not engaged in a struggle between comparable industrial powers. It suggested instead that Germany had picked a fight with a nation so wealthy, so productive, so absurdly abundant that it could afford to feed its prisoners better than Germany could feed its own people, and could do so while simultaneously producing tanks and planes and ships in quantities that Germany could not match, and while maintaining a civilian standard of living that most Germans could barely remember. Unteroffizier Friedrich Müller, captured at Anzio in January 1944 and transferred to a POW camp in Arkansas, recorded in his diary, later recovered and translated by American historians, his reaction to his first meal in American custody. "They brought us eggs. Real eggs, not powdered, not ersatz, but eggs from chickens. And bacon. I have not seen bacon since before the war. And white bread with butter and jam. I ate until I thought I would be sick. And then I went to my bunk and I wept, because I understood for the first time that we had lost. Not lost this battle or that campaign, but lost in a way that made all our fighting meaningless. How can you defeat a nation that feeds its prisoners eggs and bacon? How can you defeat a people who have so much that they can give it away to their enemies and never notice the loss?" This was not an isolated reaction. Camp records, prisoner letters, post-war interviews all reveal the same pattern: initial disbelief, followed by grudging acceptance, followed by a slow, grinding realization that everything they had been told about America was false, and that the implications of that falsehood meant Germany could not win, had never been able to win, was fighting a war against an opponent whose resources were effectively unlimited compared to Germany's increasingly constrained capabilities. The American authorities, to their credit and eventual understanding, recognized that well-fed prisoners were more cooperative prisoners, but they did not initially grasp the propaganda value of their own abundance. That realization came gradually, as camp administrators noticed that German prisoners were more interested in working. Camp labor programs, which paid nominal wages and provided privileges, than in resisting or escaping. The escape rate from American POW camps was remarkably low compared to camps in other theaters. Between 1943 and 1945, there were only about 200 escape attempts from camps holding hundreds of thousands of prisoners, and most of those attempts ended with prisoners turning themselves in after a few days. Not because they were recaptured, but because they realized they had nowhere to go, no way to blend into American society, and frankly, no reason to want to leave an environment where they were safe and well-fed and could wait out the war in relative comfort. This passivity disturbed some German officers, particularly the hardcore Nazis among the prisoner population. They recognized that American abundance was destroying German fighting spirit more effectively than any interrogation or propaganda program could. There were attempts by Nazi loyalists within the camps to maintain discipline, to punish prisoners who cooperated too enthusiastically with American authorities, to preserve some sense of ideological commitment. But these efforts increasingly felt like desperate rearguard actions against an overwhelming force. How could you maintain belief in German racial superiority and German military invincibility when the evidence of American superiority was literally being served on meal trays 3 times a day? The symbolism of food throughout the POW experience functioned as a recurring motif that collapsed the distance between propaganda and reality. Every meal was a refutation of Nazi ideology. Every egg was evidence that America was not on the verge of collapse. Every piece of white bread with real butter was proof that American industrial capacity was not producing shoddy goods, but was instead producing such abundance that it could afford to waste food, to serve fresh produce that in Germany would have been carefully rationed, to throw away leftovers that German families would have treasured. And it was not just the quantity of food. It was the casualness with which it was served. American guards ate the same food as prisoners, sometimes sitting at adjacent tables in camp mess halls. There was no sense that this food was precious or scarce, or had been carefully allocated by a centralized authority. It was just food. Ordinary food, The baseline expectation of American life extended even to enemy prisoners because that was the standard, the normal. The default condition of existence in a nation that had not been bombed, had not been invaded, had not experienced anything approaching the hardships that Europeans took for granted. By 1944, as the war ground toward its inevitable conclusion, American authorities began to recognize the strategic value of prisoner treatment. German POWs were allowed to send letters home, and those letters, while censored for military information, were not censored for descriptions of camp conditions. German families began receiving letters from captured sons and brothers describing the food, the treatment, the strangeness of American abundance. These letters circulated, were read aloud, were discussed in hushed tones by people who were eating rutabaga soup and ersatz bread and wondering when the bombing would stop. The psychological impact on German civilian morale was significant. If America could afford to feed its enemies so well, what chance did Germany have? If captured soldiers were healthier and better fed than soldiers still fighting, what was the point of continued resistance? The propaganda dimension extended beyond food. German POWs were housed in camps that, by European standards, looked more like small towns than prisons. Barracks were wooden structures, not overcrowded, with adequate sanitation and medical facilities. Prisoners were allowed to form sports teams, to put on theatrical performances, to attend classes. The U.S. Army actually established educational programs teaching English, civics, and trade skills to prisoners who were interested. Libraries were stocked with books, including carefully selected materials about American democracy and German history that presented alternatives to Nazi interpretations. The goal was not merely to contain prisoners, but to re-educate them, to prepare them for eventual return to a post-war Germany that America hoped would be democratic and cooperative rather than revanchist and militant. This re-education program had mixed results. Hardcore Nazis remained hardcore Nazis, at least outwardly, but many younger prisoners, especially those who had been drafted into military service without strong ideological commitment, found themselves reconsidering their beliefs in the face of direct experience with American society. They worked on American farms through labor programs, interacting with American families who treated them as human beings rather than monsters. They saw American small towns with their churches and schools and businesses, communities that functioned without authoritarian control, where people seemed genuinely free to make choices about their own lives. They experienced casual American kindness, farmers' wives who served them lemonade on hot days, local residents who donated books or sports equipment to camps, interactions that suggested Americans did not harbor the racial hatred that German propaganda had insisted defined American attitudes toward Germans. Feldwebel Hans Schmidt, captured in Normandy in July 1944 and sent to a camp in Colorado, worked on a wheat farm near Fort Collins through the labor program. He would later write in a letter that was intercepted and preserved in Army intelligence files, "The farmer's wife gave me pie, apple pie with ice cream. She did not have to do this. I am her enemy. Her son is fighting in Europe, perhaps fighting against my former comrades. And she gave me pie and asked me about my family, and told me she hoped I would get home safely when the war ended. I do not understand this. I do not understand how a people can be at war and still be kind. In Germany, we were told that war means total hatred, total commitment to destroying the enemy. But this woman gave me pie. I think perhaps we were told many things that were not true. This recurring motif, the small gesture of abundance, the casual sharing of food or comfort, functioned as a solvent on ideological certainty. It is easy to believe propaganda about enemy inferiority when the enemy is an abstraction, a target viewed through a bomb sight or a rifle scope. It is much harder to maintain that belief when the enemy's wife is serving you pie and asking after your health. The human dimension of American abundance. The way that wealth translated not just into military hardware, but into a kind of casual generosity. was something that Nazi ideology had not prepared German soldiers to encounter or process. Not all prisoners responded to this treatment with gratitude or reconsideration. Some maintained rigid ideological loyalty, viewing American kindness as weakness, interpreting abundance as decadence. There were incidents of violence in camps, usually involving Nazi loyalists, attacking prisoners who they viewed as collaborating too enthusiastically with American authorities. But these incidents were relatively rare, and camp authorities learned to segregate the hardcore Nazis into separate facilities, allowing the majority of prisoners to adjust to camp life without intimidation. The adjustment, for many prisoners, involved a slow, painful recognition that they had been lied to. Not just about specific military situations, soldiers expect to be misinformed by their own side, accept that wartime propaganda exaggerates enemy losses and minimizes friendly casualties. But about fundamental realities of the world. They had been told that America was weak, divided, on the verge of collapse, and instead they found themselves in a nation so strong, so unified, so industrially productive that it could fight wars on two fronts, supply allies across 3 continents, maintain high civilian living standards, and still have enough surplus resources to feed hundreds of thousands of enemy prisoners better than those prisoners had eaten in their own military. The scale of the deception produced varied responses. Some prisoners became embittered, angry at their own leaders for lying to them, for sending them to fight an unwinnable war. Others became depressed, withdrawing into themselves, unable to process the gap between what they had believed and what they had discovered. Still others became curious, intellectually engaged, wanting to understand how America had achieved this level of prosperity, whether it could be replicated in Germany after the war. What political and economic systems had produced such abundance? American authorities encouraged this curiosity. The re-education programs were designed not to brainwash prisoners, but to expose them to information and perspectives that Nazi propaganda had suppressed. Prisoners were shown films about American history, about democratic governance, about the industrial processes that produced American military equipment. They were given access to American newspapers, carefully selected editions that included stories about war production, civilian life, political debates. The goal was to demonstrate that American strength came not from racial purity or authoritarian control, but from democracy, from free enterprise, from a pluralistic society that mobilized diverse populations toward common goals. How effective was this re-education? The evidence is mixed. Post-war studies of repatriated German POWs found that those who had been held in American camps were more likely to support democratic reforms in occupied Germany, more likely to oppose efforts to revive Nazi ideology, more likely to view America favorably compared to prisoners who had been held in Soviet camps or had remained in German custody throughout the war. But correlation is not causation. It's possible that prisoners who ended up in American camps were already less ideologically committed, that the selection process, who surrendered to Americans versus who fought to the death or was captured by Soviets, filtered for soldiers who were more pragmatic and less fanatical. Still, the anecdotal evidence is compelling. Thousands of German POWs chose to remain in the United States after the war, immigrating legally once they were eligible, building lives in the country that had been their enemy. This was not a mass phenomenon. Most prisoners wanted to return home to families and familiar landscapes, but the fact that any significant number chose to stay suggests that their experience of American captivity had fundamentally altered their sense of national identity and allegiance. One prisoner, whose story has been documented in multiple historical accounts, was a former Hitler Youth member named Walter Schmid. Captured in Italy at age 19, he arrived in America expecting to be executed or at best worked to death in a labor camp. Instead, he was sent to a facility in Alabama where he worked in a furniture factory through the labor program. He was paid nominal wages, which he could spend in the camp canteen on cigarettes, toiletries, and small luxuries. He attended English classes in the evening. He played soccer on weekends. He wrote letters home describing his treatment, letters that were eventually received by his family in Stuttgart, who initially did not believe what he was telling them because it contradicted everything they knew about what happened to prisoners of war. When the war ended, Schmid was offered the chance to return to Germany. He declined. He requested permission to remain in the United States, to immigrate legally. In an interview conducted decades later, he explained his decision. "I had seen what Germany had become: rubble, starvation, occupation, guilt. And I had seen what America was, not perfect, not without problems, but alive and forward-looking and willing to let me build a life. I chose the future. I chose the place that had fed me when my own country could not, that had treated me with decency when my own leaders had treated millions with brutality. I chose America because America, even as my enemy, had been kinder to me than Germany had been to its own people." This sentiment, echoed in various forms by other prisoners who chose to stay, reveals the profound psychological transformation that American captivity could produce. It was not simply that America was materially better off than Germany, though that was true. It was that American abundance reflected deeper differences in political culture, in social values, in the relationship between government and citizen. Nazi Germany had demanded total sacrifice, total obedience, total submission to the state. America asked something different. Work hard, play by the rules, pursue your own happiness within a framework of law and shared democratic norms. For prisoners who had grown up in authoritarian systems, this American approach to governance was both strange and powerfully attractive. The economic dimension of abundance deserves particular attention. American prisoner of war camps consumed enormous resources: food, clothing, medical supplies, administrative personnel, construction materials for new facilities as the prisoner population grew. The total cost of maintaining 400,000 German POWs from 1943 to 1946 ran into hundreds of millions of dollars. This was not a trivial expense, even for American wartime budgets. Yet it was borne without apparent strain, without cuts to military operations, without reductions in civilian rations, without any sense that America was choosing between prisoner welfare and other priorities. The resources were simply there, produced by an industrial economy operating at full capacity, generating wealth faster than the government could spend it, even with simultaneous wars in Europe and the Pacific. German prisoners recognized this economic reality, perhaps more clearly than many Americans did, because they had experienced the opposite. They had seen Germany's economy strain and crack under war's demands, had seen resources allocated with increasing desperation, substitutes replacing real materials, quality declining as quantity increased. And now they were living inside the American economic machine, consuming its products, experiencing its casual waste. Camp mess halls threw away food that would have fed German families for days. Supply shipments arrived with such regularity that shortages were rare and quickly resolved. The contrast was inescapable and devastating to any lingering belief in German economic superiority. But abundance alone does not explain the full psychological impact of American captivity. Equally important was the rule of law, the sense that prisoners had rights that would be respected, that camp administration followed predictable procedures rather than arbitrary whims of individual officers. German prisoners could file complaints through proper channels if they felt mistreated. Red Cross inspectors visited camps regularly and took prisoner concerns seriously. There were formal procedures for discipline, for labor assignments, for medical care. This bureaucratic structure, tedious as it often was, provided a kind of security that many prisoners had never experienced in their own military, where discipline was harsh, arbitrary, and often brutal. The American approach to discipline was particularly striking to German prisoners accustomed to Wehrmacht standards. In German military culture, officers maintained authority through fear, through harsh punishment for minor infractions, through a rigid hierarchy that demanded absolute obedience. American guards, by contrast, were often informal, sometimes friendly, rarely brutal. Prisoners who misbehaved faced loss of privileges, no canteen access, no recreation time, rather than physical punishment. This lighter touch was initially interpreted by some prisoners as weakness, but over time, many came to recognize it as strength of a different kind, a system that could maintain order without constant violence, that could command respect through fairness rather than fear, suggested a kind of social confidence that Germany's authoritarian system lacked. There were exceptions. Some camps had abusive guards. Some commanders ran their facilities with harshness that violated Geneva Convention standards. These abuses were documented, investigated, and usually corrected, itself a revealing fact about American military culture. The system had mechanisms for self-correction, for accountability, for addressing injustice. This was not something German prisoners took for granted. Coming from a military where brutality was often official policy and where complaints about mistreatment would likely result in punishment for the complainer. By late 1944, as Germany's military situation deteriorated and the Allied advance accelerated, American authorities began receiving German prisoners in unprecedented numbers. The camps expanded rapidly, new facilities opening across the country to handle the flood of POWs from France, Belgium, and eventually Germany itself. Among these later prisoners were men who had experienced the full horror of the war's final phase, the Allied bombing campaigns that had reduced German cities to rubble, the collapse of food distribution systems, the breakdown of civil order. These prisoners arrived in America not merely defeated, but traumatized, carrying with them the visceral knowledge of what total war meant for the losing side. For these late war prisoners, the contrast with American abundance was even more shocking than it had been for earlier captives. They had left a Germany that was starving, burning, dying. They arrived in an America that looked like it was hosting a years-long picnic. The cognitive dissonance was so severe that some prisoners experienced psychological breaks, unable to process the gap between the hell they had left and the comfortable captivity they had found. Camp medical records document cases of prisoners who refused to eat, convinced that the food must be poisoned or that accepting it was somehow a betrayal of their suffering comrades still in Europe. Others ate compulsively, unable to stop, as if they could somehow consume enough abundance to fill the void left by Germany's destruction. Obergefreiter Ernst Weber, captured in the Ardennes in January 1945 during the final German offensive in the West, wrote in a letter to his wife, intercepted by camp censors and preserved in army intelligence files. "You must understand that I am ashamed. Ashamed to be eating beef and potatoes while you survive on whatever scraps the occupation authorities provide. Ashamed to be safe while our cities burn. Ashamed to be warm while our people freeze. But I am also grateful. Grateful to be alive. Grateful that I will survive this war and perhaps see you again. Grateful that the Americans, despite everything we did, despite the suffering we caused, have chosen to treat us as human beings rather than animals. This gratitude shames me more than anything else, because it means acknowledging that our enemies are better than we were, that their system produced not just more tanks and planes, but more decency, more humanity, more of whatever quality it is that makes men treat even their enemies with basic respect. This shame, this guilty gratitude, appears repeatedly in prisoner correspondence and post-war memoirs. It reflects a profound moral reckoning, a recognition that the war had revealed not just military, but ethical superiority on the Allied side. Germany had fought for racial domination and produced death camps. America had fought for freedom and produced prison camps where enemies were fed and housed and treated according to law. The contrast was not subtle, and prisoners who were honest with themselves could not avoid its implications. The American camp system was not without its dark aspects. African-American guards sometimes faced hostility from German prisoners who had been taught that black people were racially inferior and resented being guarded by them. American authorities, recognizing this tension, sometimes accommodated it, which was itself a moral compromise. Allowing racist German prisoners to dictate guard assignments was hardly a triumph of American democratic values. There were also tensions around labor programs, which some critics argued violated Geneva Convention prohibitions on using prisoner labor for war-related work. Though American authorities carefully maintained that prisoners were only used for agricultural and non-military industrial tasks. But these problems, significant as they were, did not fundamentally alter the broader reality. German prisoners in America experienced a standard of treatment that was vastly superior to what prisoners experienced in most other theaters, and vastly superior to what Allied prisoners experienced in German camps. The International Red Cross, which inspected camps in all belligerent nations, consistently rated American POW facilities among the best in the world, noting particularly the food quality, medical care, and adherence to Geneva Convention standards. This differential treatment had strategic consequences. German soldiers on the Western Front, especially in the war's final months, increasingly chose to surrender to American forces rather than fight to the death or retreat towards Soviet lines. They had heard, through letters, through rumors, through the informal communication networks that exist in any military, that American captivity meant survival, meant decent treatment, meant waiting out the war in relative safety. Surrender to the Soviets, by contrast, meant likely death or years of brutal labor in Siberian camps. The choice, when given the option, was not difficult. American treatment of prisoners thus became a weapon in itself, undermining German fighting spirit, encouraging defection, accelerating the Wehrmacht's collapse. Nazi leadership recognized this problem and attempted to counter it through propaganda and threats. Soldiers were told that American prisoner treatment was a lie, that captured Germans were being worked to death or summarily executed. Officers were warned that desertion or surrender would result in their families being arrested and sent to concentration camps. But these efforts increasingly failed because they contradicted direct evidence. Letters from America were reaching Germany. Returned prisoners, some exchanged for medical reasons, brought back first-hand accounts. The truth was getting through, and the truth was damaging German morale more effectively than any Allied bombing campaign. The symbolic power of American abundance, manifested most tangibly in food, but evident in every aspect of prisoner treatment, functioned as a kind of soft propaganda that undermined Nazi ideology without requiring any explicit indoctrination. Prisoners did not need to be told that America was superior. They could taste it in every meal, see it in every well-stocked camp supply room, feel it in the casual confidence of guards who were bored rather than brutal, because they knew, without question, that their side was winning and would continue to win because resources were essentially unlimited. This abundance was not accidental or incidental to American power. It was the foundation of that power. America won World War II, not primarily because of superior tactics or braver soldiers or better generals, though all those factors mattered. America won because it could produce more ships, more planes, more tanks, more weapons, more food, more of everything than its enemies could produce, while simultaneously maintaining civilian living standards and feeding its enemies captured soldiers. This productive capacity, grounded in natural resources, technological advancement, efficient economic organization, and a large, skilled workforce, was the decisive factor in the war's outcome. German prisoners came to understand this, even if they struggled to articulate it or accept its implications. They had been taught that will and spirit and racial superiority would overcome material disadvantage. They had been assured that German soldiers, motivated by ideology and discipline, could defeat larger but softer American forces. And then they had been defeated, captured and transported to a nation where material advantage was so overwhelming that it rendered ideology irrelevant. You cannot fight abundance with willpower. You cannot defeat an industrial economy with racial theories. These lessons, learned through the humbling experience of captivity, would shape post-war Germany's development, contributing to a national consensus that Germany's future lay not in military aggrandizement but in economic reconstruction and integration with the democratic West. The epilogue of the German POW experience in America unfolded over several years after the war's end. Repatriation was gradual, beginning in late 1945 and continuing through 1946 and into 1947. Prisoners returned to a Germany that was devastated, occupied, divided, fundamentally transformed. Many returned to cities that no longer existed, to families that had been scattered or killed, to an economy that was barely functioning. The contrast with the America they were leaving could not have been more stark. They were going from abundance to deprivation, from comfort to hardship, from a society that was confident and forward-looking to one that was traumatized and struggling to survive. Some prisoners chose not to return, at least not immediately. They remained in America through various legal and semi-legal arrangements, working on farms or in industries that had grown dependent on their labor, applying for immigration status, building new lives in a country that had been their enemy, but had treated them better than their homeland ever had. This was not mass desertion. Most prisoners wanted to go home, but the fact that thousands chose to stay was itself a powerful statement about what they had experienced and what they had learned. The prisoners who did return to Germany carried with them memories and perspectives that would shape German society's reconstruction. They had seen democratic capitalism functioning successfully. They had experienced personal freedom within a framework of law. They had witnessed racial and ethnic diversity coexisting, imperfectly but functionally, in ways that Nazi ideology insisted was impossible. These experiences, shared through millions of conversations in the years after the war, contributed to West Germany's surprisingly smooth transition to democracy and market economics. Germans did not embrace democracy solely because the Allies imposed it, but because many Germans, including returned POWs, had seen it work, had lived within its structures, and had concluded that it was superior to the alternatives. There is a photograph preserved in the National Archives, taken in September 1945 at a POW camp in Kansas. It shows German prisoners playing volleyball, laughing, shirtless in the late summer sun, looking healthy and relaxed and utterly unlike defeated enemies. In the background, American guards watch with casual indifference, their attention more on a baseball game being broadcast over a radio than on the prisoners they are ostensibly supervising. The photograph is striking not for what it shows, but for what it reveals about power. Real power, decisive power, is the ability to treat your defeated enemies with casual decency because you are so confident in your victory, so secure in your superiority, that revenge is unnecessary and control is effortless. This was what German POWs saw when they arrived in America and thought they had been sent to heaven. Not heaven in any religious sense, but a kind of secular paradise of abundance and order and possibility. A place where even enemies could eat eggs and bacon for breakfast, where even prisoners could play volleyball in the sun, where even the defeated could hope for something better than mere survival. They saw a nation that had organized itself not for conquest or glory or racial purity, but for prosperity and freedom, and that in doing so had become more powerful than any nation organized around authoritarian principles could ever be. The lesson was simple but profound. Abundance defeats ideology. Prosperity undermines fanaticism. A people who are well-fed and free are stronger than a people who are disciplined and devoted to some abstract cause. These truths were self-evident to anyone who experienced both systems, who had lived under Nazi rule and then under American captivity. The tragedy was how much suffering it required to make these truths visible. How many millions had to die before Europe learned what should have been obvious from the beginning, that democracy and capitalism, for all their flaws and failures, produce better outcomes for more people than any totalitarian alternative. The German prisoners of war who passed through American camps between 1943 and 1946 were witnesses to this truth. They had believed one set of propositions about the world and had those propositions systematically demolished by direct experience. They had expected hell and found something approaching heaven, at least compared to the hell they had left behind. And in finding that unexpected heaven, they discovered truths about power and prosperity and human dignity that would shape the rest of their lives and the future of their nation. Food was the symbol that carried these truths most powerfully, because food is fundamental, undeniable, experienced directly by the body rather than mediated through ideology or propaganda. You cannot argue with eggs and bacon. You cannot dismiss white bread and butter as capitalist decadence when you are eating it and regaining the weight you lost during years of rationing. You cannot maintain belief in your nation's superiority when your captors are feeding you better than your own military ever did. The abundance, casual and seemingly endless, spoke louder than any lecture about democracy or freedom could have spoken. And so, the German prisoners returned home, carrying this knowledge, this experience of American abundance, and it changed them. Changed some of them slowly, changed others immediately, but changed them all in ways that rippled outward through German society for decades. They had seen the future, and the future was not Aryan racial purity or authoritarian discipline or glory through conquest. The future was prosperity shared widely enough that even enemies could eat well. Freedom structured clearly enough that even prisoners had rights. And confidence deep enough that the powerful could afford to be kind. This was what heaven looked like to men who had known hell. Not angels or clouds or divine judgment, but simply enough. Enough food, enough safety, enough decency to make life bearable and future imaginable. America offered them enough, and in doing so, demonstrated the essential truth that abundance, material, moral, democratic abundance is the foundation of power, the source of victory, and the only sustainable basis for peace. The prisoners went home. Most of them eventually. They carried these lessons in their memories, in the weight they had gained, in the perspectives they had acquired. And Germany slowly, painfully learned from them. Learned that there was another way. Learned that defeat could become reconstruction, that enemies could become partners, that the future might hold something better than the past if you were willing to abandon the ideologies that had led to destruction and embrace the messy, complicated, abundant democracy of the victors. That transformation from Nazi Germany to democratic West Germany had many causes. But among them, not insignificant and often overlooked, was the experience of 400,000 German soldiers who were sent to America as prisoners and discovered that their enemies were not monsters, but merely people who had built a society that worked, that produced, that had enough to share even with those who had tried to destroy it. Heaven, it turned out, was not the absence of war, but the presence of abundance. And America, for all its flaws, had achieved that abundance, and was willing to demonstrate it even to those who had fought to defeat it. That demonstration, more than any battlefield victory, may have been the decisive weapon that ensured not just military triumph, but genuine peace. Not just Germany's defeat, but its transformation into something better than what it had been. This is what the German prisoners of war saw. This is what shattered them and remade them. This is the story that history sometimes forgets in its focus on battles and generals and grand strategies. But it is a story worth remembering because it reveals a truth about power and peace that remains relevant, that the strongest nations are not those that fight most brutally, but those that build most generously, not those that conquer most ruthlessly, but those that share most freely. Not those that demand sacrifice, but those that create abundance enough that even enemies can find mercy at their table.